The last thing my father ever gave me was a locked wooden box. Not while he was alive. After he died, for almost 25 years, I believed Daniel Mercer abandoned me. Then I opened the first envelope. Within 60 seconds, I realized somebody had lied. Before I tell you the rest of this story, welcome back to Cora Stories. If you are new here, I am so glad you found us. No matter where you are watching from today, I would love to know. Take a moment and tell me your city, state, or country in the comments below. I genuinely enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and where everyone is watching from. And while you are here, I would love to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment when you discovered something that completely changed the way you remembered someone you loved? If you feel comfortable sharing, I would truly love to read your story in the comments. Some of the most meaningful conversations in our Cora Stories family begin there. And I always enjoy seeing how these stories bring people together from all over the world. And if stories about family, forgiveness, hidden truths, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, I hope you will consider subscribing and becoming part of our Cora Stories family. Now, let me take you back to the day everything I believed about my father began to fall apart. My name is Olivia Mercer. Some children grow up wondering where their father went. I grew up believing I already knew. He left. That was the story. Simple, painful, finished. Until the afternoon, a lawyer placed a locked cedar box in front of me. Inside were unopened birthday letters, photographs, court papers, receipts, small gifts that had never reached me, pieces of a life I never knew existed. I thought I was about to learn more about the man who abandoned me. Instead, I began questioning every memory I trusted. For most of my life, I believed my father abandoned me. Not disappeared, not misunderstood, not kept away, abandoned. That single word raised me. It hardened me. It followed me into classrooms, courtrooms, relationships, and every quiet room where someone tried to love me longer than I trusted them to stay. Daniel Mercer was my father. A brilliant man, people said. A charming man, some said. A complicated man, my mother said. To me, he was simpler than all of that. He was the man who left. The man who never came back. The man who, as far as I knew, missed every birthday, every school play, every graduation, every crisis, every victory. I became an attorney because I believed facts mattered, because paper mattered, because evidence mattered, because people could lie, but documents had a harder time doing it. Lawyers spend their lives believing documents reveal the truth. I was about to discover that evidence can arrive 25 years too late. Then my father died, and after his funeral, a lawyer handed me a wooden box Daniel Mercer had left behind. He said my father had given only one instruction. The box was never to be delivered while he was alive. Only after his death. The day I received it, I still had graveyard dirt clinging to the bottom of my shoes. I noticed it when I crossed my legs beneath the conference table at Whitcomb and Vale and caught sight of a thin brown crescent along the edge of my black heel. For a moment, I focused on that instead of the wooden box resting in front of me. It was easier. Dirt made sense. Funerals made sense. Dead fathers made sense. In a cold and final way, the box did not. It was made of dark cedar, polished with age, its brass corners dulled by time. Across the lid, carved in careful lettering, was my full name, Olivia Grace Mercer. I had not used Mercer in years. Legally, yes. Professionally, yes. Emotionally, never. When I introduced myself in court, Mercer sounded like a credential. When my mother said it, it sounded like an old wound. Seeing it carved into that box felt different. It felt like someone reaching across over 2 decades, refusing to let go. I did not like that feeling. Mr. Samuel Callahan sat across from me. He was older than I expected. Thin, white hair, brown suit, kind eyes made tired by years of watching families fall apart in slow motion. He had approached me after the funeral, while I stood near the back of the chapel waiting for my mother to finish speaking with a woman from church. "Miss Mercer," he had said. I turned because only judges, opposing counsel, and strangers called me that. Yes, my name is Samuel Callahan. I represented your father many years ago. I am also carrying out certain personal instructions in his estate. I nearly asked whether my father had owned anything worth calling an estate. I swallowed the thought. Cruelty would not have improved the moment. Daniel Mercer had not died wealthy. The funeral had already answered that question. There were no elaborate floral arrangements, no polished slideshow filled with expensive vacations, no long line of business associates waiting to pay their respects, no wife dressed in black, no hidden family occupying the front pew, only a modest closed coffin, a single framed photograph, a handful of former co-workers, 2 neighbors, Mr. Callahan and me, his daughter, the one who had spent the entire service trying not to feel anything. Now, inside the conference room, Mr. Callahan placed a brass key beside the box. Your father left this for you. I looked at the key without reaching for it. When he began putting it together when you were 8. Cold settled somewhere beneath my ribs when I was 8. Yes, I leaned back. That was the year after he left. Mr. Callahan lowered his eyes. Was it? I narrowed mine. I am sorry. I did not mean to challenge you. You just did. A faint smile crossed his face, perhaps. Silence settled over the conference room. Outside the glass wall, a young associate hurried past carrying a stack of case files. She glanced inside. She saw my funeral dress. She saw the cedar box. Then she looked away. People almost always looked away from grief when it appeared beneath fluorescent office lights. I tapped one finger against the polished table. What exactly is inside? Mr. Callahan looked at the box before answering. Letters. I waited. And some personal effects. What kind of personal effects? Things your father believed belonged with you. My eyes narrowed. Documents? Yes, what kind? He folded his hands on the table. Your father asked me not to summarize the contents. That is convenient. He believed summaries were dangerous. I gave a humorless laugh. He should have tried showing up instead. Mr. Callahan's expression did not change. He hoped you would let the contents speak before reaching a verdict. I reached that verdict a long time ago. His gaze settled briefly on the box. Then perhaps you should know what evidence it was based on. But your father believed verdicts deserved to be challenged when new evidence appeared. I recognized restraint. I practiced it every day in court. It was the look attorneys wore when they knew something the other person had not yet discovered. That unsettled me. He looked down at the box. Before you open it, your father asked me to tell you one thing. I almost said I did not care. Instead, I waited, he said. Tell my daughter I did not leave because I stopped loving her. I hated how quickly that sentence found the crack in my certainty. It did not make me cry. It made me angry, fast, sharp. Clean anger was useful. Love complicated things. Grief slowed them down. Anger stood up inside me like an attorney rising for cross-examination. He waited until he was dead to say that. Mr. Callahan did not flinch. He waited until no one could use his words to pull you back into a fight. What fight? He said nothing. I reached for the key. My hand stopped halfway. For one impossible second, I was not 32 anymore. I was 7. Standing at the front window in a yellow dress, white tights, holding a drawing I had made at school. A house, a sun, 3 stick figures. Mommy, Daddy, me. My mother stood behind me, with one hand resting gently on my shoulder. He is not coming tonight, sweetheart, I remembered asking. Tomorrow. I remembered her hand tightening. I do not think so. The memory ended there. It always ended there. I had replayed it so many times that it no longer felt like a memory. It felt like evidence. The first night I learned waiting could become humiliation. The brass key felt colder than it should have. Funny how ordinary objects become heavy when they are carrying almost 25 years of unanswered questions. I slipped the key into the lock. For one impossible second, I wished it would not fit, because as long as the box remained closed, the story I had lived with since childhood could remain untouched. The moment the lock turned, one of us was about to lose the version of the past we had spent 25 years protecting. The funeral had ended less than 3 hours earlier. People were still posting condolences online. Flowers were still arriving at the cemetery, and already my father was dismantling the story I had spent most of my life believing. I hated that. Grief is easier when the dead stay exactly who you thought they were. The box seemed determined to make that impossible. If he wanted a trial, I said. He should have known I became very good at them. Then I opened the box. The lid lifted with a soft wooden sigh. Everything inside had been arranged with painstaking care. Not cluttered, not hurried, layered. Envelopes tied with faded ribbon, small wrapped parcels, photographs tucked into protective sleeves, a stack of neatly folded documents, a blue journal, a cloth pouch, a cassette tape, a USB drive, and resting on top of everything else, one cream envelope. Olivia, age 8. My breathing caught before I could stop it. Age 8. Not Olivia. Not my daughter. Age 8. As though he had known exactly where to begin, as though every year of my childhood had been waiting quietly beneath my anger. I slid one finger beneath the flap. The paper inside was thick, soft, and yellowed around the edges. Something small slipped into my palm. A silver bracelet, a tiny book charm, dangled from it. I stared at it. For one impossible moment. The conference room disappeared. I saw sunlight stretching across a living room carpet. I saw a younger Daniel Mercer sitting cross-legged on the floor, pretending to take notes while I explained that dragons needed laws because breathing fire in public was rude. Then, I heard him laugh. Not the polite laugh people described at the funeral, his real laugh warm open. The laugh I had forgotten I remembered. My fingers closed around the bracelet. Then I unfolded the letter. My Olivia. Today you are 8. I do not know if you still love books, but the last time I saw you, you carried 3 picture books into the living room and told me you were studying dragon law. You said dragons needed rules because fire could not be used every time someone felt angry. I told you that made perfect sense. You looked at me very seriously and said, "Daddy, law always makes sense when people are fair." I did not know how to answer you then. I still do not. I bought this bracelet because you once told me every serious reader needed something shiny to tap against the table while thinking. I tried to bring it to you today. I was told it was not a good time. I will try again. If I cannot give it to you, I will keep it safe. One day, if you ever wonder whether I remembered your birthday, please know this. I remembered before I slept. I remembered when I woke. I remembered every hour in between. Happy birthday, my girl. Daddy? Daddy? The word landed harder than I expected. Somewhere along the way he had stopped being daddy. He became your father. Then Daniel, eventually that man. Yet inside this letter he was still daddy. I read it again. Then I went back to the paragraph about the bracelet, the sentence about trying to bring it, the promise to keep it safe, and finally, the words that would not let me go he had remembered. Before he slept, when he woke, every hour in between, my grip tightened around the bracelet, a tiny silver bracelet, a tiny book charm, a tiny crack in everything I believed, because for almost 25 years I had mistaken silence for indifference. That was the story I built my life around. He left. He forgot. He moved on. So I learned to become harder, sharper, better. Every missed birthday became another reason to succeed. Every unanswered question became another reason not to need him. And now, I was holding proof that he remembered. Proof that he tried. Proof that somewhere inside the story I had trusted for 2 decades. Something did not fit. That was the cruelest part. Not that he left. That, maybe, he had tried. And I had spent most of my life convicting a ghost of a crime I was suddenly no longer certain he had committed. The realization settled inside me, heavy, unwelcome, dangerous. Certainty had protected me for years. Now doubt had begun quietly taking it apart. Daddy belonged to a life before explanations, before your father, before he is not well, before he made his choices, before my mother stopped saying his name unless she absolutely had to. I looked at Mr. Callahan. He tried to bring this. Yes. Where? To your mother's house. Heat climbed into my face. My mother said he stopped coming. Mr. Callahan held my gaze. I believe your mother told you what she believed you needed to hear. That is not an answer. No, he nodded once. It is not. I hated him for speaking like a man carrying answers he refused to hand over. I reached back into the box. Beneath the envelope rested a photograph. I was sitting on Daniel's shoulders in a park. My hair was tied into 2 uneven puffs, his hands wrapped securely around my ankles. My mouth was wide open with laughter. He was looking up at me with such unguarded joy that I had to turn the photograph over. On the back he had written, "The last Saturday before the orders changed." I stared at the sentence. Orders. Not feelings, not choices, orders. I turned the photograph over again. For the first time in almost 25 years, something stronger than anger appeared. Curiosity. Not forgiveness. Not trust. Not even doubt. Curiosity. And curiosity is dangerous when hatred depends on certainty. Mr. Callahan watched without interrupting. I placed the photograph beside the letter. What orders? He reached toward a folder beside his chair. My eyes followed his hand. No, he stopped immediately. Wait. The word surprised both of us. Some instinct told me not to rush ahead. Daniel had arranged the box in a particular order. For the first time, I wanted to understand why. I reached for the second envelope. Olivia, age 9. It felt slightly thicker. Inside were pressed purple violets, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Delicate, fragile, preserved. The letter carried the faint scent of cedar and dust. My Olivia, today you are 9. I stood across the street from your school today. Not near the gate. Not close enough for you to see me. The order says, I cannot approach you without supervision. I watched you walk out with your backpack hanging from one shoulder. You were wearing purple shoes. When you were 5, you told me purple was what blue becomes when it misses red. I have repeated that sentence more times than I will ever admit. I bought these violets from a woman outside the courthouse. I planned to give them to you after the hearing. The hearing did not go the way I prayed it would, so I pressed them instead. Your grandmother once told me flowers last longer when they are pressed between heavy books. Maybe love does too. Maybe that is foolish. I am learning fathers become foolish when they cannot hold their children. I hope you are laughing. I hope you are eating. I hope school is kind to you. Most of all, I hope you never believe I forgot, Daddy. I lowered the letter onto the table. The envelope held something else. A small photograph, brown wrapping paper, a faded red ribbon, a little package with my name written across the front in Daniel's careful handwriting. Return to sender. The words had been stamped across the paper in thick black ink, still unopened. Mr. Callahan quietly slid another document toward me. The carrier returned it 3 weeks after Christmas. I turned the photograph over. December 26th. Daniel had written only one sentence. She still deserves to know, I remembered. I sat with the picture longer than I intended. It was the first time I understood that forgetting someone and failing to reach them were not always the same thing. My chest tightened. Not because the letter explained everything, it did not. A man could write beautiful words and still fail the people he loved. A man could remember every birthday and still be absent. Love written on paper could never replace a father standing in the room, but one word refused to leave me: orders. I looked at Mr. Callahan now. Without speaking, he opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Temporary custody order. Caroline Mercer versus Daniel Mercer. My mother's name. My father's name. My name. The language was cold. Clinical, almost bloodless. Supervised visitation suspended pending child welfare evaluation. I read the sentence once, then again, suspended, pending, evaluation. I was an attorney, words mattered. Suspended did not mean forever. Pending did not mean finished. Evaluation meant someone had been asked to decide what was safe. I swallowed. What caused this? Mr. Callahan answered carefully. There was an incident outside the house during the divorce. What kind of incident? Daniel came to see you. Your mother refused, he shouted. A neighbor called the police. Did he threaten her? No charges were filed. That is not what I asked. Mr. Callahan shook his head slowly. No, he said. I held his gaze, waiting. He said things in anger. He denied threatening harm. Your mother reported feeling afraid. I leaned back slowly. There it was, not innocence, not guilt. Something far more difficult. A frightened mother, an angry father, a little girl inside the house, and somewhere between all of them, a court trying to translate pain into legal language. My fingers drifted back to the bracelet. My mother's voice returned with startling clarity. Your father is not stable right now. Your father loves you, but love is not always safe. You do not have to see him until you are ready. I had been 8, then 9, then 10. Somewhere along the way, until you are ready, quietly became never. I reached for the third envelope, Olivia, age 10. A photograph slipped free before I unfolded the letter, a bright red bicycle. Silver handlebars, a white basket, a little chrome bell. Behind it rested a receipt from Ainsley Cycle Shop paid in cash. Daniel Mercer. I unfolded the letter. My Olivia, today you are 10. I bought you the red bicycle you circled in the store window the summer before everything changed. You said it looked fast enough to outrun bad weather. I asked the shop owner to hold it for me while I waited for permission to bring it to the supervised visitation center. The visit was canceled. Then the next. Then the next. They said you were distressed. Maybe you were. Maybe hearing my name makes your stomach hurt now. If that is true, I am sorry. Not for loving you, never for that, but for becoming part of what frightens you. I do not know how to fix a door. I am no longer allowed to approach. I do not know how to explain love to a child who has been taught to flinch at the sound of my name. I do know this. I will keep the bicycle receipt. Not because a receipt is the same as riding through the park together. It is not. But because one day, if you believe I never tried, I want you to know I bought the bicycle. I waited. I asked. I came. Daddy. I turned the receipt over. Another note had been added years later. The shop owner sold it after 2 months. I told him to. A child should never have to wait for a bicycle that cannot reach her. Heat climbed into my throat. I looked up sharply. Why were the visits canceled? Mr. Callahan opened another folder. Visitation Center notices. Canceled by custodial parent. Canceled due to child distress. Canceled pending therapeutic recommendation. Canceled pending review. I turned another page. Canceled. Another page. Canceled. Another. Canceled. By then I had stopped reading the dates. I already knew how each page would end. The same language. The same explanations. The same outcome. I read every page. There were more than I expected. Not enough to explain an entire childhood, but enough to disturb everything I thought I knew. Enough to make me wonder why no one had ever shown me even one. Fragments of memory surfaced. Stomach aches before scheduled visits. Not vivid, just pieces. My mother kneeling in front of me, both hands resting gently on my shoulders. You do not have to go if you are scared. Am I scared? That is what your body is telling us, sweetheart. I believed her. Children usually do. Adults give names to feelings. Children trust the names. I lowered the notices. Nobody tells you how easily children become the center of battles they never understand. Not through cruelty, not always through lies, sometimes through fear. Quiet fear. Inherited fear. The kind passed from one generation to the next without anyone realizing it. It begins with careful words. You do not have to go if you are scared. I just want you to feel safe. Maybe every sentence was spoken with love. Maybe every sentence was believed. Maybe my mother was hearing echoes from a childhood that had nothing to do with my father. But children borrow fear before they know how to question it. If Mom was afraid, then perhaps I should have been too. I looked down at the stack of canceled visits. For the first time in my life, I wondered how many of my memories actually belonged to me, and how many had been handed to me by the adults trying to protect me. I rested my hand on the papers. What if I really was distressed? Mr. Callahan's expression softened. Then you were distressed. That does not answer whether he caused it. No, he said quietly. It does not. I hated that answer, and at the same time, I respected it. Real truth rarely rushes in to comfort us. It waits until we are strong enough to survive it. I closed the final folder. I am done for today, Mr. Callahan nodded. I thought you might be. He stood, gathered the remaining documents, then paused. The box is yours now. He rested one hand lightly on the lid. Do not rush it. I was not planning to, I replied. He spent 24 years putting it together. His eyes met mine. You do not have to understand it in one afternoon. For reasons I could not explain, those words stayed with me. I carried the box home because I refused to fall apart in a conference room surrounded by glass walls. My apartment overlooked the city from the 21st floor. Pale hardwood floors, white walls, a gray sofa, clean lines. Quiet rooms. No family photographs. People assumed that meant I liked modern design. Minimalist. Disciplined. The truth was simpler. I had built a home where nothing could ambush me. No framed birthdays. No smiling childhood portraits lining a hallway. No faded school pictures tucked into silver frames. Nothing that could quietly ask who had been standing outside the edge of the photograph. I set the wooden box in the middle of my dining table. Then I walked away from it. I filled the kettle, watched the water boil, made tea, left it untouched. I changed out of my funeral dress, pulled on black trousers and an oversized sweater, anything softer than the clothes I had worn to bury my father. When I finally picked up my phone, the screen lit with 13 missed calls. Every one of them from my mother, one voicemail. I pressed play. Olivia, please call me when you leave the law office. She sounded exhausted. I know Samuel may have given you something. I do not know what Daniel kept, and I do not want you going through old pain by yourself. Her voice grew smaller. Please, call me. The recording ended. The apartment fell silent again. I stared at the phone for several seconds. Guilt would have been easier. Anger would have been familiar. Instead, I heard fear. Not the sharp fear of someone about to be caught. The quieter fear of someone who already knew the past could no longer be held together. I placed the phone face down. Not because I was ready to ignore my mother, because I was no longer certain which questions belonged to her and which belonged to the man who had spent 24 years answering them before I ever thought to ask. The box waited patiently on the table. For the first time since leaving the law office, I realized I was no longer opening it to prove Daniel Mercer had abandoned me. I was opening it because I no longer knew whether he had. There is a difference. One begins with certainty. The other begins with courage. I took a slow breath. Then I carried the box into the living room. Night had settled over the city. Lights stretched across the skyline, like thousands of tiny windows into lives I would never know. I switched on the lamp beside the sofa, opened the box again, reached for the next envelope. Olivia, age 11. I called her. She answered before the second ring. Olivia, did you know about the box? Her breathing changed. I knew there was something. How? Daniel mentioned years ago that he was preserving things. Preserving things. I heard her exhale softly. Olivia, please do not do this tonight. Do what? Turn grief into an investigation. My eyes drifted to the box. I am an attorney. That is what people hire me to do when someone hides evidence. The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. I did not hide evidence. No? No. Then why did I never see the bracelet? I heard her draw in a slow breath. What bracelet? The one he brought when I was 8. I do not remember a bracelet. The bicycle. Her breathing changed when she finally answered. My name came out carefully. Olivia. That one you remember. Her voice tightened. I remember many things, not all of them the way Daniel chose to remember them. It is remarkable how memory becomes convenient. It is also true. I leaned back and closed my eyes. For a moment, I saw her the way I used to. Caroline Mercer. Younger, always exhausted, always beautiful in a way sharpened by worry, always checking the locks before bed, always watching my face whenever my father's name entered the room, always telling me, "You are safe." I realized I had not asked that question in years. Safe from what, Mom? My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Did he try to see me? She answered too slowly. The silence reached me before her words did. He tried. My fingers tightened around the phone, and you told me he stopped. I told you he stopped coming in ways that were good for you. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second and stared at it as though distance might make her words sound less impossible. Then I brought it back. Listen to yourself. I have listened to myself for almost 25 years. Olivia, her voice cracked. I have lived with every sentence I ever spoke to you. Then maybe tonight, I swallowed. You can live with some of mine. She did not answer. I could hear her breathing. Then she whispered something I never expected to hear. Your father loved you. I lowered myself into the nearest chair. For years there had always been another sentence attached to those words. Your father loved you in his own way. Your father loved you, but he was troubled. Your father loved you, but love is not always enough. Now there was nothing after them, only your father loved you. The simplicity of it frightened me. Why are you saying that now? Because it is true. Then why did you spend my childhood making it sound like he chose not to? She drew a shaky breath, because I needed you to stop waiting. The words settled somewhere deep inside me, not because they were cruel, because they made sense. That was the part I hated. You needed me to stop waiting, yes. So you gave me abandonment. I gave you an explanation. You gave me a wound with a name. A quiet sob escaped her. I closed my eyes again. I wanted to feel victorious. I did not. Victory requires an enemy. This was my mother, the woman who packed my lunches, the woman who stayed beside hospital beds, the woman who applauded every graduation, the woman who had loved me every single day of my life, the woman who might also have helped erase my father one careful sentence at a time. I am going to keep reading. Please. Her voice barely carried through the phone. Do not read everything tonight. Why? Because Daniel was always good with words. I looked toward the cedar box. And you are afraid I will believe him. I am afraid you will believe paper more than you believe memory. I answered so quietly I almost did not hear myself. Maybe memory has had too much power. Neither of us spoke again. I ended the call. Silence settled over the apartment. The tea had gone cold. So had the room. I sat across from the box for a long time before opening the next envelope. Tucked behind the letter was a folded school program. My elementary school, spring music night, my name had been circled neatly in blue ink. Inside was a single yellow sticky note. Saturday in the last row. She played beautifully. She never saw me. I looked down at the program again. Tucked behind it was a folded photocopy of a note on school letterhead. Permission granted for Mr. Daniel Mercer to attend the spring music night program under the agreed conditions. He was to remain in the last row. He was not to approach me. He was not to make his presence known. My eyes returned to the program. My father had watched me perform. I had stood beneath the stage lights believing he was somewhere else in the world, and all along, he had been sitting in the last row. Close enough to hear me, far enough away to keep his promise. That night, I went to bed believing he had forgotten I existed. I reached for the next envelope, Olivia, age 11. Inside rested a small journal with a midnight blue cover scattered with silver stars. I touched it gently. Memory answered before I opened it. A bookstore window. My nose pressed against the glass. That journal. I wanted that journal. My mother smiled. Maybe for your birthday. On my birthday, she gave me a pink one covered in flowers. I loved it, but somewhere inside me, I quietly mourned the blue one. Daniel had remembered. I unfolded the letter. My Olivia, today you are 11. You once told me secrets become less frightening once they are written down. I bought you this journal because I hope you still have somewhere honest to leave your thoughts. I hope no one has taught you to be polite with your sadness. I hope no one has convinced you that keeping adults comfortable is your responsibility. I wanted to send this through the visitation center. There is no active visitation plan anymore. Mr. Callahan believes we can petition again. I will. I am tired. I do not want that sentence to sound like surrender. It is not. But I need one place where I can tell the truth, even if it is only on paper you never read. I am tired of being measured by the worst night of my life. I am tired of hearing people say best interest of the child, as though anyone in that courtroom knows what you whispered after falling asleep in the car. Daddy, do not forget where I live. I never did, Daddy. Inside the journal, tucked between the first pages, rested another court filing, petition to modify visitation, denied. Motion for therapeutic reunification, continued. Request for review of supervised visitation suspension, continued pending evaluation. Attached was a handwritten note. Do not sound angry. Do not interrupt. Answer only what is asked. Bring counseling records. Do not mention Caroline unless asked. Do not cry. Do not cry. Do not cry. I stopped on the final line 3 times. A grown man reminding himself not to cry because tears might be mistaken for instability. I knew that kind of preparation. I had written similar reminders before major trials. Drink water. Keep your voice steady. Do not interrupt. Never look desperate, because desperation is often mistaken for guilt. I opened the journal again. The first page contained only one sentence. For Olivia, if silence ever becomes too heavy. I closed the journal and held it against my chest. A memory surfaced without warning. I was 13, maybe 14, sitting on the floor of my bedroom while my mother folded laundry. Do you think Dad ever thinks about me? She stopped folding. For a long time, she said nothing. Then quietly, I think Daniel thinks mostly about himself. I nodded. Not because I believed her, because I saw the sadness in her face, and without realizing it, I wanted to protect her from it. That is something no one tells you about children. They are not only protected by adults, sometimes they spend their childhood protecting the adults they love. The envelope marked age 12 felt lighter than the others. There was no gift, only a photograph. And another letter. The photograph showed a small house I did not recognize. White siding, green shutters, a narrow porch with 2 empty rocking chairs. I turned it over. No address. No explanation. Only the date. I unfolded the letter. My Olivia. Today you are 12. I almost bought you a gift. I stood inside a stationery store for nearly 40 minutes, holding a set of watercolor pencils. You used to draw little houses with purple doors. You insisted every happy home needed one. I put the pencils back. Instead, I paid another legal retainer. Then I lost the house anyway. I am writing this from a rented room above a hardware store. The radiator bangs through the night. The ceiling leaks whenever it rains. Every Sunday morning, the man downstairs plays old blues records loud enough for the whole building to hear. You would have named every sound. You used to name everything. The toaster was Mr. Crumbs. The old blue car was Lady Blue. The neighbor's strange garden statue was Professor Frog. You made ordinary things feel important. I miss living in the world you named. I sold the house because I believed another sacrifice might convince the court I was serious. Stable, employed, counseled, patient, ready. I thought if I gave up enough, someone would remember I had once been your father before I became a case file. I was wrong. Or maybe I was simply too late. Sometimes I think time is the cruelest judge of all. By the time you finally prove you have changed, everyone has already built a life around the person you used to be. I hope your life is gentle. I hope your mother is kind. Most of all, I hope you never mistake my absence for an easy choice. It never was. Not for a single day, Daddy. I lowered the letter slowly. The photograph remained in my hand. He had sold his house. I read that part again, then looked at the receipts tucked behind the letter. Legal retainers, counseling, evaluations, court filings, parenting classes. Every recommendation placed before him seemed to have left another paper trail. Then I found the closing statement from the sale of his house. Behind it was a handwritten note. I thought if I kept doing everything they asked, eventually someone would let me be her father again. My fingers tightened around the page. He had sold his house, kept paying attorneys, kept attending counseling, kept submitting to evaluations, kept following recommendations, and still, he had ended up in the small rented room shown in the photograph. I studied it again. A narrow bed, a battered radiator, a window overlooking the hardware store below. For the first time, the room did not look temporary. It looked like what remained after hope became expensive. I traced the edge of the photograph. So, this was where he had gone. Not into another family. Not into some better life where I had been replaced. Here, a rented room above a hardware store. The realization settled somewhere deep inside me. The photograph no longer looked like poverty. It looked like exile. I slipped it back into the envelope. Then, something else caught my attention. Another folded receipt, moving expenses. A storage unit. 3 boxes, I frowned. 3 boxes. Attached to the receipt was a handwritten inventory. Olivia's drawings, school papers, birthday decorations, baby shoes, report cards, photographs. Do not discard. My eyes stopped on the final line. Belongs to my daughter. I unfolded the receipt completely. On the back, Daniel had written one sentence. Never sell her childhood before she has the chance to remember it. I closed my eyes. For years, I believed my father had walked away carrying nothing. Instead, he had spent most of my life carrying pieces of me, not valuable things. Not things anyone else would have thought twice about. Just the small remains of a childhood he had been forced to watch from a distance. The ordinary treasures parents keep without thinking, except Daniel had thought about every single one, because they were all he had. I looked toward the wooden box. It suddenly seemed larger than before, not because there was more inside it, because I was finally beginning to understand what it had been carrying all these years. Not evidence, not documents, not even memories. Hope, quiet, persistent, unreasonable hope, the kind only a parent can carry long after everyone else has decided to let go. I remained at the table, my fingers resting against the edge of the storage receipt. The apartment seemed different somehow, not quieter. Heavier, as though the ordinary objects listed on that page had brought an entire missing childhood into the room with me. I looked toward the cedar box. For the first time, I did not feel the need to open the next envelope immediately. Some truths deserve time to settle before another one arrived. When I finally reached into the box again, my hands were gentler than they had been that morning. I picked up the next envelope, Olivia, age 13. Behind the letter were more receipts. Legal retainer, counseling, parenting classes, certified mail, child support, school library donation, medical insurance contribution. 3 returned parcels. I spread them across the dining table. The apartment lights reflected against the glass, making each receipt look almost translucent ghosts printed on paper. So much effort, so much sacrifice, so much that never reached me. A receipt cannot hug a child. A court filing cannot applaud at a school play. A returned package cannot explain why birthdays feel incomplete. And still, these were not nothing. For most of my life, I had been told there was nothing. Nothing is easy to hate. This was not. I slept very little that night. The following morning, I carried the box to my office. I told myself it was because deadlines would not wait for family history. That was only partly true. The real reason was harder to admit. Leaving the box behind felt too much like abandoning it. And I was beginning to understand that abandonment is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like deciding not to look. My office at Halden, Pierce & Row occupied the corner of the 36th floor. glass walls, mahogany desk, frame degrees awards. Olivia Mercer, partner track. Rising litigator, impossible to intimidate. Priyanandan looked up as I walked in carrying the cedar box. You are supposed to be on bereavement leave. I know. That usually means staying away from the office. That usually assumes people have ordinary families. She stood. Early 40s, sharp-eyed, quietly compassionate beneath layers of efficiency. I blocked your calendar for the entire week. I know. You are not planning to work, are you? I looked down at the cedar box. No. Then I surprised myself. I do not think I can. She glanced at the box, then back at me. I will make sure nobody disturbs you. I nodded. Thank you. She hesitated. Is that from your father? I followed her gaze. Yes, she smiled sadly. My father left me a storage unit full of fishing gear and unpaid parking tickets. I blinked. Priya gave a small shrug. I cried over both. Despite everything, I smiled. That sounds inconvenient. Her expression softened. Grief usually is. She slipped out before I could answer. At noon, I locked the office door. The city continued moving beyond the glass. Inside, time seemed to slow. I opened the next envelope. Olivia, age 13. Inside rested a small velvet pouch. I loosened the drawstring. A tiny gold compass. Necklace slipped into my hand. Simple, unpolished, its needle drifted slowly until it found north. I held it toward the window. The compass kept turning, then settled. The letter unfolded beneath it. My Olivia, today you are 13, a teenager. I almost wrote that it feels impossible. Then I remembered how much you disliked adults pretending children never grew up. This compass is not because I think you are lost. It is because I hope you always remember you can choose your direction. Even when someone else chooses the road. Today I signed something. You deserve to know that. Even if you do not read these words for many years, the therapist recommended a pause in active visitation efforts. She believed the anticipation was increasing your anxiety. Your mother cried outside the office afterward. I hated her for that. Then I hated myself for hating her, because she was not pretending. She truly believed I was hurting you. Maybe I was. Not because of what I had done, because of what my presence had become. Court dates, questions, stomach aches, whispers, adults studying your face for evidence. Every part of me wanted to keep fighting, every part. But love cannot be measured only by how tightly a father refuses to let go. Sometimes love has to ask whether holding on is hurting the child more than letting go. So I signed. They called it temporary. I never believed it would be. I signed anyway, not because I stopped wanting you, because I wanted you to breathe. Daddy, I read those final words again, then again. Each time they rearranged something inside me. For my entire life, I had believed one sentence. He stopped fighting for me. That belief followed me through school, through college, through law school, through every relationship where I quietly expected people to leave. Now that sentence looked different. He stopped fighting because he believed the fight itself had become another wound. The difference was almost unbearable, because sacrifice and abandonment can look painfully alike to the child left standing at the window. The compass turned slowly between my fingers back and forth, searching, then settling. Some truths do not set you free the moment you find them. They ask you to rebuild everything that came before. I laid the necklace on the desk, picked it up again, held it tighter this time. For the first time, I was no longer asking whether my father had loved me. I was asking whether I had misunderstood what his love had looked like. Behind the letter rested another document. Agreement regarding therapeutic pause and contact boundaries. Signed by Caroline Mercer. Signed by Daniel Mercer. Signed by both attorneys. My mother's signature flowed neatly across the page. My father's looked heavier. The pen had pressed so deeply into the paper that I could feel the grooves with my fingertips. Attached to the agreement was a page torn from Daniel's journal. April 23rd, signed today. Callahan believes we can revisit this in 6 months. Caroline would not look at me. When I asked whether Olivia knew what was happening, the therapist told me not to make this any harder for whom I wanted to ask. I did not. I watched Caroline walk to her car. She looked exhausted. Not victorious, not relieved, just exhausted. I remembered loving her. That memory unsettled me more than I expected. Anger prefers simple stories. Heroes, villains, people who never change. Life almost never cooperates. Caroline had once danced barefoot across our kitchen with flour on her cheek while Olivia laughed from her high chair. She had once fallen asleep holding my hand in the hospital after our daughter was born. She had once been the safest place I knew. Now she was the locked door between me and my child. Neither memory erased the other. I lowered the journal onto my desk. For a long time I simply sat there. The office around me disappeared. The city disappeared. Even the box disappeared. There were only two parents, both convinced they were protecting the same little girl. One fought by holding on, the other fought by letting go, and somewhere between those two kinds of love, a child grew up believing she had been abandoned. I understood something then that no courtroom had ever taught me. People rarely destroy one another with a single terrible decision. More often, they build tragedies one understandable choice at a time. I closed my eyes. My mother protected me. That was true. My father frightened her. That was true. My father loved me. That was also true. My mother loved me. No document inside this box had ever questioned that. The hardest part was accepting that love had not prevented any of them from hurting one another, or me. I opened my eyes again. The contradiction was still there. It always would be. Not every question is resolved. Not every wound chooses a side. Sometimes healing begins the moment we stop demanding that one parent become the villain, so the other can become the hero. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let them remain human. I folded Daniel's journal page carefully and slipped it back inside the envelope. For the first time, I was no longer trying to decide who had ruined my childhood. I was trying to understand the frightened, imperfect people who had lived it before me. That was a much harder question, and somehow a much kinder one. I spent the next hour reading Daniel's journal from that year. Not every page was noble. Some were angry. Some were bitter. A few unsettled me. One entry read, "I hate Caroline today. I know I should not write that. I know a better man would choose gentler words. I am not a better man today. I am a father with empty hands." Another entry said, "I drove past the school again. I should not have. I did not stop. I did not slow down. Still, I should not have. I am becoming a ghost in places where I used to be a father." I read both entries twice. They mattered, not because they excused him, because they refused to polish him. Saints would have been easier. Saints do not shout outside houses. Saints do not drive past schools after promising themselves they will not. Saints do not fill private journals with anger they would never speak aloud. But fathers do. Broken fathers, frightened fathers, human fathers. The box was never asking me to admire Daniel, it was asking me to see him honestly. That was far more difficult. At 3 o'clock, Priya knocked gently. "You have a visitor. I canceled everything. It is your mother." Cold spread through me. "Tell her I am unavailable." Priya met my eyes through the glass. She said she will wait. Of course she would. Waiting was one thing my mother had always known how to do. I gathered the journal pages and placed them back inside the box. Then I opened my office door. She stood beside Priya's desk wearing a navy coat, both hands wrapped tightly around her purse. Perfectly composed, except for her eyes. They were red. "Olivia, not here." "Then where?" "The conference room." Priya suddenly became very interested in her computer screen. Neither of us believed it. We walked in silence. The moment the conference room door closed, my mother spoke. "How much have you read?" I met her eyes. "What are you afraid I have read?" She flinched. A tiny movement, almost invisible. I hated how satisfying it felt. Olivia, I know Daniel kept things. I do not know everything he kept. He kept the compass. Something crossed her face. Recognition. Regret. Both disappeared almost immediately. You remember, she turned away. He sent it. No, I shook my head. He bought it. He signed an agreement not to send it because the therapist believed I needed room to breathe. Her hand rose slowly to her throat. He wrote those words, yes. She stared at the floor. I did not know, but you knew he signed. Yes. And you let me spend almost 25 years believing. He stopped caring. I let you stop hurting every time his name came up. Those are not the same thing. I know. The answer came too quickly, too quietly. For a second, it almost disarmed me. Then 25 years returned. You know that now. Or you knew it then. She gripped the back of a chair. I knew some things then. I understand more now. That sounds like a statement prepared with legal counsel. Her eyes flashed. Do not question me like I am on the witness stand. Then stop answering like you are afraid of perjury. Silence settled between us. Mother-daughter. Two women trained in different kinds of survival. Finally she spoke. Your father was not easy to be married to. I did not ask that. No, she nodded slowly. But maybe you should have. I folded my arms. Fine. Was he abusive? She closed her eyes. No, the word sounded almost painful. Was he violent? No. Did he ever hit you? No. Did he ever hit me? Her eyes opened immediately. Horrified. No, never. Then what exactly was I being protected from? Her voice trembled. Instability, rage, emotional chaos. The possibility that one day shouting would become something worse. But it never did. No, and you built our lives around something that never happened. She lowered her head. I built our lives around the fear that it might. The room fell silent. No careful explanations, no polished language. Just one exhausted truth. I built our lives around the fear my anger should have been satisfied. Instead, grief arrived first. Why? She wiped beneath one eye. Because I was afraid too, my father shouted before he hit. My mother always said, he has never touched the children. Until one day, that sentence stopped being true. She paused. When Daniel shouted outside our house, I was not only hearing Daniel, I was hearing every door from my childhood slam again. Nothing in the room moved. Not me. Not her. Not the air between us. I should have felt victorious. I had letters, receipts, journal entries, court documents, admissions, every piece of evidence I had spent my career trusting. But revenge becomes strangely complicated when the person across the table is your mother. The woman who packed your lunches, the one who sat beside hospital beds, celebrated your birthdays, loved you fiercely, and still helped erase your father. No villain, no monster, just a frightened woman trying to save her daughter from a future she had already survived herself. I wanted someone simple to blame. Instead, I found people, broken people, good people, people whose love had quietly wounded the very person they were trying to protect. Somehow, that hurt far more. I looked at my mother differently. She rarely spoke about her childhood. When she did, it always came in sealed sentences. Difficult, strict, unpredictable. I had never asked for more. Maybe children learn early which doors adults do not want opened. She broke the silence. I know none of that makes what I did right. No, it does not. I know. Did Daniel know? Some of it. Did the court? They understood why I was afraid. Her eyes dropped. They never understood how much of that fear belonged to another life. I felt the meaning of those words settle between us. My father had frightened her, but he had not created every fear she carried. Some of it had begun long before Daniel, long before me, and somehow I had grown up inside the consequences. She reached toward me. Instinctively, I stepped back. Her hand fell. I am not ready. She nodded. I know. No. Mom. My voice softened. You really do not. You had a story where you stayed. Dad had a story where he was kept away. I had neither. I had a verdict. She covered her mouth, and I built my life around it. I turned before she could answer. Behind me, I heard her begin to cry, for the first time in my life. I kept walking. It did not feel satisfying. It did not feel cruel. It simply felt necessary. Sometimes justice begins with refusing to protect the person who once believed they were protecting you. That evening, I drove to the house where Daniel had spent the final years of his life. Mr. Callahan met me there. There were still estate papers waiting to be signed. The house stood on a quiet street shaded by old maple trees, modest homes, front porches, flower beds beginning to fade with the season. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, studying it. This was not the house Daniel had sold years ago, not the rented room above the hardware store where he had lived after legal fees and court battles consumed so much of what he had. This came later, a smaller house, a quieter life. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had rebuilt enough to begin again. Not extravagantly, not completely, but enough to have a front door of his own. I stepped out of the car. The house was smaller than I expected. I am not sure what I had imagined. Something neglected, something lonely. A place that looked as abandoned as I believed he had abandoned me. Instead, the house looked cared for, not expensive. Not impressive, simply cared for. Blue shutters framed the windows. The concrete walkway had cracked with age. Several clay pots sat beside the steps. The herbs inside had begun to wither, but someone had watered them not very long ago. Daniel had been living here, not merely existing. Living. Mr. Callahan unlocked the front door. The house greeted us with the quiet scent of coffee, old books, and furniture polish. A brown coat still hung beside the entrance. A pair of worn shoes rested neatly beneath it. For one strange moment, it felt wrong to walk inside, as though I were entering a life that had not realized it had ended. Then I saw the photograph. It hung beside the staircase. Me, kindergarten. Missing front tooth, crooked bangs, bright blue background. I stopped walking. Mr. Callahan stopped beside me. He kept that there. Yes. How did he get it? Your school mailed copies to everyone who donated to the library. I stared at the little girl smiling back at me. Picture day. I remembered crying because one curl looked too bossy. My mother laughed until she could barely breathe before fixing it. That memory had always belonged to her. Now I realized it had belonged to him too. The same little girl, living in two different homes, loved by two different parents. I reached out and touched the frame. How long has it been here? As long as I knew him. My hand lingered another moment. Then I let it fall. The living room waited just beyond the hallway. A worn leather chair faced a wall of bookshelves. The cushions had settled into the shape of the man who had spent years reading there alone. Nothing felt staged. Nothing felt preserved for visitors. This was simply how Daniel lived. My eyes drifted toward the mantel. More photographs. Not family portraits. Pieces of my life gathered from a distance. My high school graduation announcement. A newspaper clipping from my housing discrimination case. A photograph from the law firm's website. A magazine article mentioning one of my appellate victories. I moved closer. Each one had been framed carefully. Each one looked less like decoration and more like a window. Windows into a life he was never allowed to enter. I picked up the newspaper clipping. Housing discrimination attorney wins landmark appeal. There was a yellow sticky note attached to the back. She fights for people pushed away from home. Of course she does. My vision blurred. Mr. Callahan remained quietly in the doorway. He followed your career. Through public records. He nodded. Whenever he could. I turned the article over again. That sounds lonely. It was. The honesty of his answer echoed through the room. I looked around the house. Did he ever build another life? Mr. Callahan understood exactly what I meant. Friends, neighbors, a church group for a few years, and me. No partner? No. No other children? No. I had spent years secretly believing another family existed somewhere. a second wife, children who called him dad, a dining table where someone else had taken my place. That story had protected me because it was easier to imagine being replaced than to imagine being missed. The house quietly dismantled that lie. There was no second family, no hidden life, only shelves filled with borrowed pieces of mine. Programs, articles, photographs, newspaper clippings. A father building a relationship out of whatever fragments the world allowed him to keep. I walked slowly along the bookshelf. Every few inches, another reminder waited. A community newsletter announcing my college scholarship, a photograph from my law school graduation, an article celebrating my first jury verdict. He had followed every milestone, never close enough to congratulate me, never far enough to stop caring. I rested one hand on the bookshelf. The room suddenly felt unbearably quiet. People often imagine grief arrives all at once. It does not. Sometimes it waits patiently inside ordinary rooms, inside framed photographs, inside handwritten notes, inside a house where someone spent years loving you from a distance. I turned toward Mr. Callahan. Was he happy here? He thought about the question before answering. He learned how to live here. There was a difference. I heard it immediately. Learned, not found. Not chose. Learned. As though happiness had become something he practiced instead of something he possessed. I looked around the room one last time, for the first time since opening the cedar box. I no longer felt like I was visiting my father's house. I felt like I was meeting him. Mr. Callahan led me into Daniel's study. Against one wall stood a tall filing cabinet. He unlocked it with a small brass key. Daniel left instructions. He slid open the top drawer. Anything labeled with your name belongs to you. There were 3 drawers. Each one carried a simple label. Olivia. I laughed once, then covered my mouth. 3 drawers. After almost 25 years of believing I had been forgotten. There were 3 entire drawers devoted to me. The first held school clippings, debate tournament results, honor roll announcements, library newsletters, articles about scholarship recipients. The second contained legal records, custody orders, attorney correspondence, visitation schedules, support payments. The third held journals, dozens of them. Not all about me. That surprised me. His life had not become one endless ache. There were pages about the weather, books he enjoyed, neighbors, recipes that failed spectacularly, repairs around the house, interesting court cases, songs that stayed in his head for days. He had continued living. Not completely, not freely. But honestly, that realization caught me off guard. I reached for one written when I was 14. August 9th saw Olivia today by accident. At least I hope it was an accident. I was leaving the pharmacy. She came out of the bookstore with 2 girls. She has braces now. She laughed, then stopped suddenly, almost as though she caught herself being happy too loudly. That is Caroline. That is me. That is also something neither of us owns anymore. That is Olivia becoming Olivia without me. I stayed across the street. Every selfish part of me wanted to call her name. Every frightened part of me wanted to know if she would turn. I did not. A father who truly loves his daughter sometimes stays where he is standing. I closed the journal slowly. The leather chair beneath me answered with a quiet creak. Did he come here often? Mr. Callahan looked up. Where? My school. The bookstore. Places where he might see me sometimes. That sounds uncomfortably close to stalking. It does. He did not soften the word. He knew that too. He wrote about struggling with it. He spent years trying to separate the desire to see you from the responsibility to respect the boundaries. Did you tell him to stop? Many times, did he? A faint smile crossed Mr. Callahan's face. Most of the time, I looked back down. Most he was human Olivia. He was suffering. I nodded slowly. Those are not the same thing. No, they simply live together. I returned the journal to its place. On Daniel's desk sat a small wooden tray, a wristwatch, reading glasses, paper clips, a brass key. and one folded note with a single word written across the front. Study. Mr. Callahan noticed where I was looking. That one is yours too. I unfolded it. My Olivia, if you are reading this in my study, then you have entered the room where I spent too much of my life learning how to miss you quietly. I am sorry for the photographs. Maybe they will feel loving. Maybe they will feel invasive. Perhaps they are both. I kept what little I could find because the alternative was pretending I had no daughter walking somewhere beneath the same sky. I could never do that. There were years when I thought grief might turn me into a cruel man some days. It came close. I am not proud of every thought I entertained. I am not proud of every drive past your school. I am not proud of how often I imagined your mother regretting everything. But I am proud that I never made my pain your burden after I promised I would not. Keeping that promise cost more than I can explain without sounding like I am asking for sympathy. I am not. I am asking only for accuracy. I loved you. I lost access. I made mistakes. I kept records. Some days I waited well. Some days I waited terribly. But I never stopped being your father, even when no one called me that, Daddy. I folded the letter carefully. Accuracy. Such an unusual word to end with. Then I smiled to myself. Maybe not unusual. Maybe inherited. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat. There is something in the safe. What? A package marked for later. Daniel suggested you wait until after the age 14 and 15 envelope suggested. A quiet smile reached his face. He said you would hate being told what to do, despite everything. I laughed. He remembered that very well. I carried the box home. Midnight had settled over the city before I opened it again. The skyline shimmered beyond my windows. My mother called twice. I let both calls ring through. The age 14 envelope contained photographs. My school, the bookstore, a park bench, a courthouse hallway, a church basement. At first they seemed unrelated. Then the pattern appeared. Each place marked a moment. A canceled visit. A hearing. A glimpse of me from a distance. A support group. The letter was shorter than the others. My Olivia, today you are 14. I am not sending a gift this year. Buying objects that never reach you has begun to feel dishonest. So I am sending places instead. Perhaps that sounds strange. The school is where I watched you laugh with your friends. The bookstore is where I stood too long after you walked away. The courthouse is where I learned silence can be ordered and still never become peace. The church basement is where I joined a group for parents who had lost contact with their children. I hated it the first week. By the third, I hated needing it. One father there said something I have carried ever since. If your child hates you, survive long enough for the truth to have a witness. I am trying, Daddy. Behind the photographs rested a pamphlet, Estranged Parents Support Group. I stared at the title, estranged, such a careful word. Too careful. It made separation sound mutual, as though children drift away by choice, as though the tide asks permission before carrying them somewhere else. A journal page sat behind the pamphlet. A man named Russell said today that he writes letters and burns them. I told him I write letters and keep them. He asked why. I said, because one day Olivia may need proof. He smiled. Or maybe you will, maybe both. I lowered the page. There it was again. Daniel was not preserving the box only for me. He was preserving himself inside it. Because disappearing from someone's life creates a desperate need to leave fingerprints somewhere. I understood that more than I wanted to admit, while Daniel measured time through hearings, canceled visits, and support group meetings. I measured mine through school dances, report cards, debate tournaments, first heartbreaks, friendships that felt permanent until they quietly disappeared. Looking back now, the contrast hurt more than anything else. He spent those years trying not to forget me. I spent those same years learning how not to need him. The age 15 envelope felt heavier than the others. Inside rested a small framed certificate. It was not mine. It was his. Completion of anger management and emotional regulation program. Daniel Mercer, 12 weeks. Behind it lay another certificate. parenting after high conflict separation, then therapy receipts, then one final letter. My Olivia, today you are 15. I almost left these papers out. I worried they would look like a man waving certificates around as proof that he deserved forgiveness. Paper can prove attendance. It cannot prove change. Perhaps it can only prove willingness. The truth is simpler. After the divorce, I was angry. Not every day, not in the loud, constant way stories sometimes imagine, but often enough that your mother had reason to fear my voice, often enough that I had reason to be ashamed of it. I never struck her. I never struck you. But I spoke words I wish I could gather back from the air. I stood outside the house where my daughter slept, and I made myself look like danger. That matters. I have replayed that night more than any other day of my life except the day you were born. One made me your father. The other slowly turned me into a visitor. Then, not even that. If someone has told you I was unstable, they were not entirely wrong. If someone has told you I did not love you, they were both things can live inside the same broken man. I am trying very hard to become less broken. Not because I believe it will bring you back. Maybe nothing will. But because if life ever gives us another chance, I do not want you to meet the worst version of me. Daddy, I remained still long after I finished reading. No earlier letter had done what this one had just done. Daniel had admitted something no court order could have forced from him. He had frightened my mother, not with violence, not with fists, but with anger he failed to control. For the first time, I could see both of them standing outside that house. My mother young, terrified, hearing echoes of a childhood she had never escaped. My father, heartbroken, desperate, watching every door close in front of him. Neither of them understood that I would spend the next 25 years living inside that moment with them. Was my mother wrong to be afraid? No, fear rarely asks permission before it arrives. Was she wrong to let that fear become the only story I inherited? Yes, that was where everything broke. Not in the shouting, not in the divorce, not even in the courtroom. It broke the moment fear became certainty. I thought back to the years that followed, every sentence my mother spoke, every letter my father wrote but never sent, every canceled visit, every birthday, every silence. None of it fit into the neat story I had carried since childhood anymore. Life had refused to choose a villain. Instead, it had handed me two frightened parents, one trying to protect me from the future, the other trying to find his way back to me from the past. Neither succeeded. Both loved me. Both failed me. I realized something then. Children do not inherit only their parents' love. Sometimes they inherit their unfinished fears. Sometimes they inherit their unanswered grief. Sometimes they inherit stories so incomplete they mistake them for truth. I looked again at Daniel's certificates. For years I would have dismissed them as performance. Now they look different. Not proof that he had become perfect. Proof that he had finally begun telling the truth about himself. That mattered. Because healing never begins with pretending we were better than we were. It begins the moment we stop hiding the parts we wish had never happened. I carefully returned the certificates to the envelope. Not because they erased what Daniel had done, nothing could, but because they deserved to remain beside the confession that gave them meaning. For the first time, I stopped asking which parent had been right. Instead, I began asking a different question. How many lives are quietly shaped by fear that never gets the chance to heal? That question stayed with me long after I closed the box. The package from the safe arrived the following afternoon. Mr. Callahan brought it himself. When I opened the apartment door, he held the brown paper parcel with both hands as though it contained something that deserved gentleness. What is it? I know generally. He smiled faintly. Not specifically. That sounds like another lawyer's answer. It is simply the most honest one. I stepped aside. He walked in without comment, though I noticed his eyes drift briefly around my apartment. People always looked. The place was beautiful. Bright windows, clean lines, carefully chosen furniture. Everything exactly where it belonged. Beautiful in the way hotel rooms are beautiful, comfortable. Orderly, temporary, there was almost nothing that told the story of the person who lived there. Mr. Callahan set the parcel beside the cedar box. Daniel asked that you receive this only after you understood he was not an innocent man. I looked up. He actually said that. More than once. He worried you might mistake explanation for absolution. I stared at the package for a moment before cutting the string. Inside was a single folder. Caroline, my mother's name. My heartbeat changed. I expected accusations, evidence, old court filings. Instead, I found letters, dozens of them. Every one addressed to my mother, none of them mailed. The first began simply, Caroline, I was cruel on the telephone today. You were cold. I was cruel. Both things can exist together. I want to tell you your fear is unfair. Then I remember your face outside the house that night. You were not pretending. I hate that my grief borrowed the shape of your childhood. I closed my eyes. Then opened another. Caroline, the therapist says, Olivia becomes anxious before visits. Part of me wants to blame you. Part of me does. Then I remember she is a little girl. Little girls become frightened for reasons adults never fully understand. Please help me make her less afraid. I no longer know how to ask for that without sounding as though I am accusing you. Another Caroline. Happy birthday. I remembered you never liked chocolate cake. Your father bought one every year anyway, even after you begged for vanilla. Funny what the heart remembers. I hated remembering today. I hope Olivia made you laugh. The letters continued. Some were angry, some unexpectedly tender. Some wandered between both emotions in the space of a single page. Nothing about them felt rehearsed. Nothing sounded like a man trying to win an argument. Only someone writing because silence had become unbearable. At the bottom of the folder rested an old photograph taken before I was born. My mother sat on a picnic blanket with her head thrown back in laughter. Daniel lay beside her, watching her instead of the camera. The expression on his face startled me. I had never seen either of them look that young or that unguarded. In my memories, they had always existed on opposite sides of something. Seeing them happy together felt strangely intimate, almost intrusive. I turned the photograph over. Daniel had written only one sentence. Before we became evidence against each other. I lowered the picture. Mr. Callahan remained quietly by the window. Why did he keep these? He wanted you to know your mother was always more than the decisions that hurt him. I looked at him. He defended her. In the end. Yes. Why? He answered, without hesitation. Because he loved you more than he needed to win. The room seemed to grow quieter. I looked again at the photograph, then at the letters, then at my mother's name. I remembered her confession. I built our lives around the fear. I remembered Daniel writing words he never intended anyone else to read. Before we became evidence against each other for the first time, the story stretched beyond me. That realization unsettled me. Children do not ask whether a divorce was complicated. They ask why someone stopped coming home. At 7, that question was enough. At 32, it no longer was. I had finally reached an age where I could hold more than one person's pain without losing sight of my own. I opened the next envelope. Age 16. Inside rested a heavy gold pen. Elegant, balanced. Exactly the kind I used to admire whenever older students signed debate certificates after competitions. Daniel remembered, the letter unfolded beneath it. My Olivia, today you are 16. You may be learning to drive. I will pretend that thought does not terrify me. Mr. Callahan found a school newsletter announcing your latest debate victory. Of course you won. They quoted you saying, truth matters most when it is inconvenient. I had to sit down after reading those words. I wonder whether you know how deeply I agree. I wonder whether you would hate me if you knew my truth. Perhaps you already do. I bought this pen because words are becoming tools in your hands. Please use them carefully. Words defend. Words wound. Words build bridges. Words convince children their fathers stopped loving them. I am not placing that blame entirely on your mother. I have misused words too. I used anger as language. She used protection as language. The court used procedure as language. And somewhere in the middle, you were left trying to translate silence. I am sorry, Daddy. Behind the letter rested another journal page. June 5th. Caroline called today. First conversation in 7 months. She said Olivia asked why I never write. I told her I write every year. She cried. Then she asked me not to send the letters. She said, "She is finally stable." I asked whether stable meant happy. She said, "Please do not do this." I wanted to answer, "You already did." Instead, I asked whether Olivia was eating well. She hung up. I lowered the page slowly. That final question broke something inside me. Not does she miss me. Not does she know the truth. Not even does she remember me. Only is she eating well? There is a tenderness so ordinary that it almost escapes notice, until you realize it belonged to the father you believed never thought about you at all. The apartment grew impossibly quiet. For almost 25 years, Daniel had been filling this box. At the very same time, I had been emptying him from my life. He preserved memories. I rewrote them. He collected evidence. I built conclusions. Every year he added another letter. Every year I became more certain there never would be one. We lived through the same years. Just not the same story. Another envelope slipped from beneath the journal. Inside rested a newspaper clipping, "Regional Debate Champion." My photograph smiled back at me. The edges had softened from being unfolded so many times. Across the top Daniel had written, "Bought 3 copies, 1 for the box, 1 for the refrigerator, 1 ruined because I cried on it." My vision blurred. No one had ever told me he knew I debated. No one had ever told me he followed my life so closely. For years, I believed I had become invisible to him. Instead, he had been watching from every distance life allowed. I reached for the next envelope. Age 17. The years seemed to move faster now. Childhood had quietly given way to adulthood, while Daniel measured time through court hearings, support groups, and letters he could never send. I measured mine through debate tournaments, college applications. First, heartbreaks. Friends I believed would last forever, then did not. Slowly, Daniel Mercer stopped feeling like a person. He became a conclusion, a closed file, something already decided at least. That was the story I believed, until now, my phone rested beside the box. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I called my mother. She answered carefully. "Olivia, did I ever ask why Dad never wrote?" A long silence. Finally, "Yes, when?" "You were 16 and you called him." "Yes, he told you he wrote every year." "Yes." My grip tightened around the phone, "And you still let me believe he never did." Her answer came slowly. "I did not know how to hand you letters from a man I had spent years teaching you to survive without." That is not an answer. A quiet breath reached me through the receiver. "It is the only honest one I have." I looked toward the cedar box. I found the folder marked Caroline Silence. "He kept letters to you." "What kind?" "Complicated." A sad laugh escaped her. "That sounds like Daniel. He remembered you hated chocolate cake." The line went quiet. Then I heard her crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one broken breath after another. I forgot. She struggled to continue. I forgot he remembered things like that. I closed my eyes. For years, I believed my mother remembered everything. Now I realized memory had wounded her too, not by disappearing, by surviving. "I am coming tomorrow here." "Yes." "Why?" "Because we have spent almost 25 years speaking in summaries." She did not answer. "We are finished with summaries." After we hung up, I remained seated beside the box. The apartment was silent. The city lights stretched across the windows, like another world. I looked around the room. For the first time, it no longer felt empty. The cedar box sat quietly on the table, not accusing anyone, not defending anyone, simply refusing to let one family's story remain unfinished. I rested my hand on the lid. Something had changed inside me. When I opened the first envelope, I wanted someone to blame now. I wanted to understand. That frightened me, because understanding asks far more of us than anger ever does. Anger keeps the world simple. Understanding asks us to love people after discovering how badly they failed. I was beginning to understand both of my parents. That did not erase what they had done. It simply meant neither of them fit inside the story I had been telling myself since I was 7 years old. Tomorrow, for the first time, I would stop reading letters written by the dead and begin asking questions of the living. I had a feeling that conversation would change everything. My mother had already made tea when I arrived. She always made tea when she was frightened. I had simply never noticed before. Chamomile, the white porcelain teapot, 2 cups, honey, lemon, a plate of crackers neither of us would touch. The house looked almost exactly the way I remembered. The same hallway, the same family photographs. Me at school, me in my graduation cap, me holding my first legal award. No Daniel, not one. I stood staring at the wall. Did you remove every photograph of him? My mother stopped behind me. Yes. When? The year after the divorce. Why? Because you kept staring at them. I turned toward her. I was grieving. You stopped sleeping. I was 7. I know. I shook my head. No, Mom. You keep saying that, but knowing now does not change what you chose then. She lowered her eyes. You are right. The words caught me completely off guard. I had prepared myself for explanations, for defenses, for carefully chosen language. Instead, she simply agreed. I had carried the cedar box into her house like evidence for a trial. Yet the woman standing before me looked nothing like an opponent. She looked tired, older, unarmed. We sat together at the kitchen table. I opened the box. The moment she saw the envelope marked age 8, she flinched. He came. The words echoed quietly inside me. He came, such a small sentence. Yet it shattered 25 years of certainty. Children who believe they have been abandoned tell themselves the same stories. They never tried. They never cared. They forgot us because forgetting was easy. Otherwise, how could they have survived? Now my mother sat across from me admitting something I had never imagined hearing. He came not once, more than once. He stood outside carrying a birthday bracelet for a little girl who would never know he had been there. The hardest part was no longer wondering what my father had done. It was realizing how much of my life had been built around something he had never done. Was I home? Yes. Did I know? No. Why? Because I thought everything would begin again. What is everything? Her eyes filled slowly. The nightmares, the crying, the panic every time visitation came up. The way you asked whether I was going to leave too. I looked down. I did not remember asking that. Perhaps I had. Children often absorb storms, long before they understand the weather. She continued quietly, I spent years believing I was responding to your fear. She looked down at her hands. Now I wonder if you were responding to mine. That honesty hurt more than denial ever could. I placed Daniel's age 13 letter in front of her. She read it carefully. When she reached the sentence, I wanted you to breathe. She covered her mouth. He wrote that. Yes, tears gathered in her eyes. I said those exact words to the therapist. What? I told her. I just wanted you to breathe again. The room became perfectly still. I looked down at Daniel's letter. He had taken her words, not to mock them, not to challenge them, simply to acknowledge the part of them that was true. My mother whispered. He heard me. Yes. I never believed he was listening anymore. He was, she cried quietly. I did not move toward her. I did not walk away either. That was all I had to give. We continued through the box together. Not everything, just enough. The bicycle receipt, the canceled visitation notices. Court filings, returned birthday packages, the anger management certificate, the letters Daniel never mailed, the photograph taken before they became enemies. My mother picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. I loved him. It was the first time I had ever heard those words. I know. She looked at me. No, you do not. I loved him in a way that embarrassed me after everything fell apart. People wanted me to pretend I had seen warning signs from the beginning. They wanted a cleaner story. One where I escaped. She shook her head. It was never that simple. Your father was funny. Brilliant. Tender. Proud. He could walk into a room and make everyone laugh. She smiled sadly. He could also turn an argument into a thunderstorm without realizing how frightening he had become. I listened. For once, I never interrupted. He never understood how loud he became when he was hurt. I never understood how quickly I disappeared whenever I became afraid. She looked down at the photograph. We both believed the other person had become the danger. Her eyes dropped to her hands. For several seconds, her fingers worked slowly against each other as though she were trying to untangle something that had been knotted for years. Maybe, she swallowed. Maybe the danger was what happened when our wounds started making decisions for us. I stared at her. Why did you never tell me any of this? She met my eyes. Because nuance does not comfort a crying child. No, I shook my head slowly. But lies grow teeth. She closed her eyes. Yes. Silence settled over the kitchen. Finally, she spoke again. There is something else. She disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she carried an old shoebox wrapped with yellowed tape. Nothing elegant, nothing preserved, just an ordinary box. She placed it carefully beside Daniel's. I kept things too. My heart began beating faster. She opened it. Inside rested birthday cards, tiny notes, a faded photograph of Daniel holding me as a baby, a dried rose, court papers. Then, one sealed letter, addressed to me. My handwriting, she whispered. I looked down at it. What is this? A letter I wrote when you were 18. You wrote me a letter. Yes. Why did I never receive it? She met my eyes. Because I was a coward. No explanation. No defense. Only the truth. I picked up the envelope and unfolded the letter. My Olivia, you are 18 today. There are things I need to tell you about your father. I have rehearsed this conversation so many times that I no longer know where the truth is supposed to begin. Every year I waited. It became harder. At first I believed I was protecting you. Then I realized I was protecting myself from the way you might look at me if you learned how many of my choices helped keep him away. Daniel loved you. He was not always safe inside his anger, but he loved you. I was not always honest inside my fear, but I loved you too. I do not know how to explain that we both wounded you while trying to spare you from being wounded. Perhaps one day I will be brave enough to hand you this letter. I am sorry, Mom. I lowered the paper carefully. She had written those words when I was 18. Not last year, not after Daniel died. 14 years ago, I looked across the table. You wrote this then, she nodded, and never gave it to me. Another nod. I looked at the unopened envelope again. 14 years she had carried the truth almost as long as Daniel had carried the box. Not because she did not know it, because she could not bring herself to speak it. Finally, I asked, why? She stared into her untouched tea. For a while, I believed there would always be another chance. Her voice trembled. Another birthday, another graduation, another promotion. She swallowed, and then one day I realized I was no longer waiting for the right time. I was waiting for courage. She looked up. It never came, because for the first time, I understood something neither Daniel's letters nor the court records had been able to show me. My mother had become trapped inside the very silence she created. The lie had survived so long that eventually it began protecting itself. You let me leave for college, believing he never cared. Yes, you let me become a lawyer believing the wrong man had taught me what truth meant. Tears slipped down her face. Yes, and every year after that, you kept choosing tomorrow. She closed her eyes. Yes, I stood. The chair scraped sharply across the kitchen floor. I need some air. I stepped onto the front porch. The afternoon carried the first chill of autumn. Somewhere farther down the street, a dog barked. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk. I wrapped both hands around the porch railing, breathed once. Then again, this was what I had wanted. Proof. Confession. Accountability. So why did it feel less like justice, and more like standing inside the ruins of a house everyone had once believed they were building together? The screen door opened softly behind me. My mother stepped outside. She stayed several feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to respect what little distance I still had. I am sorry. I laughed through tears. I do not know what to do with sorry. I know. I lost him. Yes, I hated him. I know. The words caught in my throat. Then they came anyway. He died. My voice broke. Thinking I hated him. Everything inside me gave way. Not the letters, not the court files, not the photographs. Not even the years we had already lost. This was the wound I did not know how to survive. Because death does something time never does. It removes every remaining opportunity to say, I was wrong. I bent forward, gripping the railing until my hands hurt. For almost 25 years, Daniel had written to a daughter who never answered. Not because she refused, because she never knew. And now, there would never be another birthday. Another graduation, another unexpected meeting, another ordinary Tuesday when I could simply walk through his front door and say, Dad, I finally understand. My mother took one hesitant step forward, then stopped herself. She knew this grief did not belong to her alone. Neither did it belong only to me. It belonged to all three of us, to the family we had once been, and the family we never had the chance to become. We remained there for a long time, neither of us speaking. The neighborhood continued around us. Children rode bicycles past the house. Someone laughed across the street. A lawnmower started in the distance. Life moved forward with astonishing indifference. It always does. Eventually my mother spoke. There is one more thing. I looked at her. The cancer. I closed my eyes. Mr. Callahan had mentioned treatments, scans, appointments, but Daniel had written about them so quietly that I had almost forgotten they were there. When did he know? About 5 years before he died. I stared at her. And you knew. Yes. Did he ever ask to see me? She nodded once. Only once. What happened? He told me. He did not want you to come because he was dying. I frowned. That makes no sense, he said. Her voice faltered. He said he wanted your last memory of him to belong to a father standing outside your graduation. Not a man disappearing inside a hospital bed. I felt something break open inside me. All those years, even dying, he had still been trying to protect the version of me he carried in his heart. I looked toward the fading afternoon sky. For the first time since opening the cedar box, I wished with every part of me that grief could travel backward, just once, just far enough to reach one lonely man sitting in a hospital room, so I could tell him, you waited long enough. I came for once she did not assume she had the right. I cried on the same porch where Daniel had once stood, holding a birthday bracelet. My mother remained behind me. She did not explain. She did not defend herself. For the first time in my life, she allowed my pain to belong completely to me. When I finally returned to Daniel's cedar box, only one birthday envelope remained. Olivia, age 18. Inside was a single envelope. No gift, just a letter, my Olivia. Today, you are 18, an adult. I smiled when I wrote that sentence because I know how much it would annoy you. You would remind me that becoming an adult does not happen overnight. You would probably be right. I have missed so many birthdays that I no longer know which version of you I picture first. Sometimes you are still the little girl who insisted dragons needed laws because fire was everyone's problem. Sometimes you are the teenager who stood in debate tournaments and made adults listen. I wonder who you are today. I hope you are brave. I hope you are kind. I hope no one has convinced you that love must always be earned. There is something I want to tell you before I say anything else. I am proud of you. Even from a distance, watching you become the woman you were meant to be has been one of the greatest honors of my life. Not because of your grades, not because of your accomplishments, not because of whatever career you may choose. I am proud of the simple fact that you kept growing. Life asked you to grow through confusion, through silence, through questions no child should have carried. And somehow, you kept becoming yourself. That is no small thing. I wish I could tell you these words while standing beside you. Instead, I leave them here. Maybe paper is all I have left. Maybe one day paper will finally reach where I could not. Happy birthday, my beautiful girl. No matter how old you become, you will always be the greatest privilege of my life. Daddy, as I lowered the letter, something else slipped from the envelope. A parking receipt, university, visitor parking. Graduation day, 8 hours. I stared at it for several seconds before turning it over. Daniel's handwriting covered the back. I stood where you could not see me. You smiled for photographs. Your friends celebrated around you. I applauded anyway. You looked so happy, that was enough. I looked at the faded receipt again, 8 hours. He had stayed for my entire graduation. Every speech, every photograph, every round of applause. My memory filled with familiar faces, friends, professors, my mother smiling photographs I had looked at for years. Yet suddenly, every one of them felt unfinished, somewhere beyond the edge of every picture. My father had been standing there watching, cheering, leaving before I ever knew he had come. For years, I believed my graduation was the first milestone he chose to miss. Now I knew it was one more memory he had quietly carried home alone. I did not open the final envelope until 3 days later. Not because I was afraid of it, because I finally understood something about the box. Daniel had built it with mercy, not comfort mercy. He never handed me the whole truth at once. He handed me enough truth to survive the next piece. The final envelope rested beneath everything else. No birthday, no age, no occasion, only one word, Olivia. I held it for almost an hour before breaking the seal. Almost 25 years rested inside that envelope. Not paper, not photographs, not receipts. Almost 25 years of love that had nowhere to go. Years of birthdays. Years of waiting, years neither of us would ever get back. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. My Olivia, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I am sorry. Not only because I died, death was never mine to choose. I am sorry because there are conversations a father should have while sitting beside his daughter, not while speaking from inside a cedar box. I wanted to tell you everything myself. I also wanted to protect you from becoming the judge of your parents. That was never your burden. It should never have become your burden. So I left the truth in pieces, not to manipulate you, not to turn you against your mother, not to make myself innocent. I am not innocent. I loved you completely, and still I failed to reach you. I frightened your mother. She made choices from that fear. She hurt me. I hurt her. The court saw what it could. The lawyers argued what they could prove. The therapists tried to reduce a family into recommendations. And you survived the only way children know how. You believed the parent who was there. Read the next sentence twice. You did nothing wrong. A child should never have to investigate love. A child should never have to subpoena the truth. A child should never have to wonder whether a missing parent stayed away by choice, or because someone believed staying away was safest. That burden belonged to us, not you. We failed you with it. I did not abandon you. I lost the right to stand near you later. I accepted distance because I believed my presence was hurting you. Then shame became another locked door. I should have found another way. I did not. There is a difference between loving someone and reaching them. I learned that too late, but I loved you, every single day, Daddy. I read the letter once, then immediately again. The words felt different the second time, as though they had been waiting for me to catch up to them. Finally, I plugged in the USB drive, The screen flickered. Daniel appeared in the leather chair from his study. Older, thinner, gray beginning to overtake his hair. His hands rested quietly on his knees. For several seconds, he simply looked into the camera. Then he smiled. "Hello, Livy." Everything inside me broke. No one had called me Livy since I was little. He looked down, smiled to himself, then looked back. I have practiced this conversation far too many times. A soft laugh escaped him, which probably means I am still going to get it wrong. I laughed through tears. Some things never change. You may be married. You may be single. You may have children. You may have decided. Children are entirely too much work. His smile widened. I would understand. I hope you are happy. I hope someone makes you laugh. I hope someone knows how you take your coffee. I hope somebody tells you when you are working too hard. He stopped. His eyes softened. I also hope somebody reminds you that winning every argument is not the same thing as being at peace. He smiled again. You started arguing with bedtime when you were 4. I assumed from that moment the world was in serious trouble. I covered my mouth for just a few seconds. I was 4 again. Then, his expression changed. I need to tell you something before anything else. Your mother loved you. I know those words may not fit easily beside everything you have already read. Hold them anyway. The truth is rarely small enough to fit inside one hand. He coughed. Waited, then continued. Caroline and I failed each other long before we failed you. That does not excuse either of us. It only explains how we arrived there. I was proud. She was afraid. I mistook fear for control. She mistook pain for danger. And for a while, I did not sound like a man anyone should trust. His eyes filled. I wish I had. I wish love automatically made people wise. It does not. He leaned forward. I need you to hear this. You were never unwanted. Not for one birthday. Not for one hearing. Not for one Christmas. Not for one ordinary Tuesday. I watched you grow from farther away than any father should. I hated every mile. He wiped his eyes. I thought about contacting you after you turned 18. I even wrote the letter. I never mailed it. I told myself you deserved the life you had built. Some days I called that wisdom. He smiled sadly. Other days, I recognized it for what it really was. Fear wearing respectable clothes, I whispered at the screen. Why? Almost unbelievably, he answered it. You may spend years asking why I did not try harder. You deserve that question. There is no tidy answer. Part of me believed staying away had become the last loving thing anyone asked me to do. Part of me was ashamed. Part of me was sick. Part of me was terrified. He swallowed, terrified that you would look at me and confirm what I feared most, that you no longer needed me. I could barely breathe, but that was my fear. It was never your voice. I should have let you speak for yourself once you became old enough. I am deeply sorry that I did not. He reached beside the chair, the blue journal. I bought this when you were 11. If you still write, keep writing. If you stopped, start again. Secrets grow heavier inside closed hearts. You taught me that. He smiled. I love you, Olivia Grace Mercer. I loved you when you believed I did not. I love you in whatever room you are sitting in. I love you even if this box makes you angry with me before it helps you understand me. His voice broke. And if forgiveness never comes, let truth come. You deserve at least that. He reached toward the camera. The recording ended. The screen became black. I remained there, waiting, as though another message might appear, as though death might suddenly become negotiable. 5 more minutes. One more conversation. One ordinary hug. Nothing happened. Only my own reflection looked back at me. Then something terrible settled, quietly inside me. The dead never return when we finally become ready for them. They arrive when they arrive. They leave when they leave, and love, no matter how deep, cannot negotiate with time. For a long time, I did not move. The apartment around me looked unfamiliar. The same sofa, the same bookshelves, the same city lights beyond the windows. Yet everything felt different. The silence no longer belonged to an empty room. It belonged to someone who had finally been heard. Eventually, I looked back inside the cedar box. Only one item remained, the cassette tape. It rested beneath everything else. Older than the letters, older than the USB drive, its plastic case had yellowed with time. Across the label, Daniel had written in careful handwriting, "Livy bedtime." I laughed through another wave of tears. Of course he kept that. Of course he remembered. I found an old cassette player in the storage cabinet beneath my television. I had bought it years ago because I thought vintage things looked interesting. I had never actually used it. The tape clicked into place. For a few seconds, only static. Then, his voice, much younger, fuller, warmer. "Livy?" A little girl's laughter answered him. "Mine?" I froze. I had forgotten what my own childhood voice sounded like. "You are supposed to be asleep." "No, you promised." "I promised yesterday," Daniel laughed. "You are already negotiating." "I am practicing for what? So I can be a lawyer." He laughed even harder. "I should probably apologize to every judge you ever meet." More laughter. Mine, his, together. The room disappeared. I closed my eyes. I was no longer 32. I was 5, safe. Without knowing how temporary safety could become, the recording continued. One story. 2. You always ask for 2, because one gets lonely. A page turned. Then Daniel began reading. Not perfectly. Sometimes he used different voices. Sometimes he forgot one and started over. Sometimes I interrupted. Sometimes I corrected him because I thought dragons should sound more serious. He let me every single time. Listening to that ordinary conversation hurt more than every court record combined. No courtroom had ever captured this. No therapist report, no custody evaluation, no visitation order. None of them could measure the sound of a father trying to make his daughter laugh before bedtime. The recording skipped. Several years passed between one click and the next. His voice returned, older, quieter. "If you ever listen to this," he stopped, then laughed softly. "Well, I suppose that means I was right to keep it." A long silence. "I wanted you to remember something. Not the divorce, not the court, not the shouting. The way we sounded before, life became so loud." His smile lingered for a moment. "You laughed with your whole body. You snorted whenever something was really funny. You insisted stuffed animals deserve last names. You once cried because a worm looked lonely after the rain." I smiled despite myself. I remembered, not everything. Just flashes, enough. "I hope nobody ever convinces you that those little girls disappear. They do not. They simply learn to hide." The tape ended with another burst of static, then silence. I sat there holding the cassette long after the player stopped turning. All my life, I believed memory was something I carried. Now I understood. Sometimes memory carries us. I carefully placed the cassette back inside its case, not as evidence, not as proof, as something far more precious. A father reading one more bedtime story. 3 days later, I visited Daniel's grave. The cemetery looked different in daylight. Less frightening, more peaceful. The fresh flowers from the funeral had already begun to fade. Someone had placed a small American flag beside another nearby headstone. Wind moved softly through the trees. I stood there for several minutes before speaking. I listened to the tape. The words sounded strangely small. I remembered the dragons. I remembered arguing with bedtime. I remembered laughing. My voice shook. I wish I had remembered sooner. The breeze answered with quiet leaves. I knelt beside the headstone. "I spent nearly 25 years believing you stopped choosing me. I know better now. I cannot give those years back. I cannot tell you this where you can answer. I cannot hear you laugh again." Tears slipped quietly onto the grass. "But I can tell you the truth." I rested one hand against the cool stone. You did not fail because you stopped loving me. You failed because life became larger than both of us. And I failed because I believed silence instead of searching for you. Neither of us deserved that. For the first time since opening the cedar box, I allowed myself to say the word Dad. The cemetery remained still. No miracle, no sign, only wind, and strangely, that was enough, because love had finally arrived where truth already had. Before leaving, I reached into my bag. Inside was the blue journal Daniel bought when I was 11, the one I never received until now. I opened to the first blank page. Then I wrote, "Dear Dad, I finally came. You waited longer than anyone should have been asked to wait. I am sorry it took me this long. I know now that love does not always lose because it grows weak. Sometimes it loses because fear grows louder. I wish we had one ordinary afternoon. Just one coffee, conversation, nothing dramatic, nothing to repair, just enough time for me to ask how you have been, and for you to ask whether I am eating well. You would probably still worry too much. I think I inherited that from you." I smiled through tears. "I love you too." I closed the journal, rested it gently against the headstone for one quiet moment, then carried it home. Some things are meant to stay with us. Not because grief ends, because love finally knows where it belongs. 1 year later, people often imagine healing as a single conversation, one apology, one embrace, one dramatic moment that repairs everything. Life has never worked that way. Healing happened quietly, one ordinary day at a time. My mother and I began meeting every Sunday afternoon, not to reopen old trials, not to argue over who remembered what, simply to learn how to tell the truth without defending ourselves. Some Sundays we talked for hours. Other Sundays, we simply drank tea. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes one of us cried. Neither of us rushed the other anymore. That became its own kind of miracle. Daniel's cedar box sat on the bookshelf in my apartment. Not hidden, not displayed like a trophy, simply present exactly where memory belonged. The blue journal slowly filled with letters, some to my father, some to the frightened little girl I used to be, some to the woman I was still becoming. For the first time in my life, writing no longer felt like preparing an argument. It felt like coming home. I visited Daniel's grave every month, not because I believed he could hear every word, because I needed somewhere to practice honesty. Sometimes I told him about work, sometimes about my mother. Sometimes I simply sat there without speaking at all. Silence no longer frightened me. It had finally stopped sounding like abandonment. One afternoon, I stood beside his headstone, holding fresh flowers. "I won another case," I said. "I still argue too much," I smiled. You would probably have enjoyed watching that. The wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time, it felt less like saying goodbye, more like continuing a conversation that life had interrupted. A few weeks later, I visited Mr. Callahan. He had officially retired. Boxes filled his office. The filing cabinet stood empty. Only one remained locked. He smiled when he saw me. I wondered how long it would take. "For what?" "For you to come back," I laughed. "I suppose I inherited stubbornness from somebody. You certainly did." We sat together for almost an hour, talking. Not about lawsuits, not about custody, not even about Daniel. We talked about books, travel, coffee, the ordinary things my father and I never had enough time to share. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Callahan handed me a small envelope. "What is this?" "The last instruction. I thought I had opened everything." "You have." This was addressed to me. I frowned. "You?" He nodded. "I was only supposed to give it to you after I believed you no longer needed evidence." I opened it. Inside was one handwritten sentence. "Livy finally has her own story now. Let mine rest. Daddy." I stood there for a long time. Then I smiled through tears. I think I can do that. When I returned home, I placed the note inside the cedar box. Then I closed the lid. Not forever. Just for today. Some stories are not meant to stay open. They are meant to change the people who read them. Mine certainly had. I used to believe evidence answered every question. Now I know something different. Evidence explains, truth heals, but only forgiveness allows either one to breathe. I no longer think of Daniel Mercer as the father who abandoned me, nor do I think of Caroline Mercer as the mother who lied to me. I think of two imperfect people who loved their daughter deeply, carried wounds they never fully healed, and accidentally handed some of those wounds to me. That inheritance stopped with me. If I ever become a parent, my children will inherit something different. Not certainty, not fear, not silence, truth. Even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult, because children deserve parents who trust them with honesty, and parents deserve the courage to tell it. Sometimes I still miss the years we lost. I probably always will. Grief does not disappear because understanding arrives, but understanding changes the shape of grief. It transforms regret into gratitude, silence into conversation, questions into peace. The cedar box taught me something I never learned in law school. Some of the most important evidence in life never belongs in a courtroom. It belongs in the hearts of the people we love. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open the box we have spent years refusing to touch. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will stay a little longer. There are so many families carrying silent misunderstandings, unspoken apologies, and love that never found the right words. If this story reminded you of someone you still have the chance to call, please do not wait. If it reminded you of someone you can no longer call, I hope it reminds you that love is never measured only by the time we had. Sometimes, it is measured by the truth we finally choose to carry. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to Cora Stories. Every week, we share deeply emotional family stories about forgiveness, hidden truths, second chances, marriage, parents and children, sacrifice, healing, and the quiet moments that change ordinary lives forever. Your comments mean more than you know. I read many of them, and I would genuinely love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed the way you remembered your past? Or have you ever forgiven someone after finally learning the whole story? Share your thoughts below. Someone reading your words may need them today. Until next time, take care of the people you love. Sometimes, the conversation you keep postponing becomes the conversation you never get to have. If Daniel and Olivia's story touched your heart, I think there is another story you may not want to miss. It is called We Pretended It Was an Adventure. It follows a family whose children believe they are simply going on an adventure, never realizing their parents are quietly sacrificing everything just to keep them safe. Click the video on your screen now. I will meet you there.